We are going to talk about security in MySQL, and I'll have talks in basically like two parts, right? One is mainly about security in database in general, right? And then specifically what recent versions of MySQL have to offer. One thing to know about databases is you can find a lot of research out there which talks about a lot of database out there is vulnerable, right? I think that was an interesting study which folks have done actually for a number of years, like just scanning the internet looking for vulnerable database, and the number is staggering, right? If you look at a database specifically on-prem, a lot of them are vulnerable, right, in a large extent, right? And what I think is very interesting about database in particular, and why I think we should take the database security very, very seriously, is because the database is exactly that pot of gold for any hackers out there, right? Because that is where you store all your important sensitive data in very convenient, well-structured format, right? It's not like if you compromise a network and able kind of to sniff something, right, from network traffic going in and out. No, it's much better, right? You get all the data in a usable form. And we have seen in a way what as a long term where data breaches has been on the rise, right, over last years. And I think there's a lot of trends in the market, right, where which makes that much more economical, right? We increasingly rely on the various electronic things for all things in life, right? And that makes, well, compromising databases very very helpful, right? And I think that's like some bunch of graphs you can find out there. So in the end, I hope what those graphs are convince you enough what your data really needs to be protected. Now, the next thing what I wanted to talk about is to talk about a little bit of key risks which exist out there, about some roles and responsibilities you may have in your team, as well as specifically what MySQL has to offer those days to get those. Now, what I have seen about security in a company, I think there are really two drivers about why companies may be looking at the security. And one is the compliance drivers, right? In many cases, if you really want to be in position to be in a certain industries, right, or process certain kind of data, you need to be compliant, and some of that compliance is focused on security. Right, like if you think about HIPAA, PCI DSS, many countries have some local security, data privacy, right, and what's not regulations, right? And then of course there is like a practical needs, right? Even if all those kind of compliance, kind of government and the third-party requirements would not exist, being insecure is bad for business, right? In many cases, if you if people find information they trusted you available somewhere in the internet, well, they probably stop trusting that information to you at the very least, right? I think in this case it's important to understand what those are the same, right? And in certain cases you would find what just be things what you're doing practically and which gives you good security may not be good enough for compliance, but then also in many cases compliance itself is kind of like a look in a rear view windows, right? They often look at these things what happened before and how to prevent them, and they may not really be enough. You may need to be really go further than actually compliance requires if you really want to protect your business, your customers well, right? So that is also a good thing to consider. Now, if you think about the security attacks which exist, I think there are two really different kinds, right? One is what you can see there is a lot of generic security attacks, right? You think about like a box, malware, you know, some viruses, right, and so on and so forth, right? They're all kind of exposed and, you know, in some stuff which is opportunistic, right? And you maybe just got caught in that net, right? And a good thing about those is what, like, some good security hygiene often gets you very far. The other is, of course, is like targeted security attacks, right? There may be some hackers which are looking to target you specifically, your company specifically, right? And that often become much more sophisticated, right? Harder to deal with, right? In certain cases, you may be dealing with, you know, some insiders, much more of that kind of, you know, social interactions, right? And I think that is also kind of good to think in about a point, right? Well, you know what, if you get your, like, imagine like a worst case scenario, your kid's kidnapped, right? There is probably certain things you may be compelled to do, right? In this case, which is, well, different from just, well, you know what, use a strong passwords. Now, if you think about security, the conventional thing about security is there is no total security out there, right? I mean, that thing kind of does not exist, and it's good to think about security as a managing risks, right? And at appropriate level for your organizations, for environment, but also to understand, hey, you know what? It is not possible to be completely secure. And what that means, in many cases, you should not only think about security in terms of how to prevent attacks, but then also, well, if incidents happen, what is your response plan and your mitigation plan? Well, you know what? If somebody happened to, you know, publish part of your database on the internet, right? Well, what exactly you're going to do, right? Again, depending on the sophistication of your organization, right, you may need a little or a lot of planning in this case, but I think that is a very important to reduce an impact on the business. You also often rely on the multiple levels of security, right? Because what you want to make sure is if one level of security is being breached, right, then you still have some protection, right? So, for example, in many cases, you would find, well, you know what, we have sensitive data as a credit card. Well, it may be, of course, stored on a very protected server, but even if you breach in that server and let's say figure out how to connect to MySQL on it, well, you still see only encrypted credit card numbers, right? Like, you need also to find some way to decrypt them to actually find the data usable for you. Right, and as I mentioned in this case, like a people and a physical aspects is often a very important factors, right? What is interesting, of course, in this case, in the cloud, we also even don't know about that, but there are in so many cases people found what you know, you have laptop which is unlocked, left outside of control, right? Or people may be able to, you know, get in your office, right, and so on and so forth. And sometimes it looks like people have, you know, this kind of the metallic, like thick front door, right? But actually you can go behind the back and that is like a window totally open for you, right? So, well, one of the frameworks which talks about security, which I think is interesting, right? But you can think, which I mentioned about the risk, which talks about those, you know, 4 items, right? Where you obviously want to assess your risks, right? You do the preventive security measures, what we focus a lot on. But then also it is important what if an incident happens, you want to make sure you detect that as quickly as possible, right? Maybe you have some automatic means to detect unusual activity and shut it down, right? Or at least alert somebody saying, hey, you know what? Somebody, it looks like they're dumping my MySQL database. Well, when they shouldn't. And then, of course, you know, recover, right? If things happen, how can you do, you know, resolve that problem. Here are some of the risks which we have to look at as specifically databases. One is, of course, the application kind of vulnerabilities, right? In many cases, when you have an application hacked and that application has access to a database, right? If we sort of have a full control of our application, we can extract the data right from the database. Now, in many cases, you also have various like system components and libraries can be vulnerable, right? We'll talk also about SQL injections and so on and so forth. A couple of other things that I want to mention from this list, which I think is interesting. One is the test database. I think one of also that specific thing is go to example of having like your front door well protected but the back window open is test databases. When people may say, hey, you know what, we are getting the data from production in the test database, we don't sanitize the data properly, right? Maybe just, use the same data as in production because, hey, you know what? It is better to test your queries, your application with real data, right? To ensure it works rather than, randomly generated data, right? And then that is a test system from which the data can flow, right? Well, make sure that's sanitized. Or the backups and database dumps, right? In certain cases that may be not encrypted, right, and also potentially misplaced. Because if anybody with a database, your kind of primary database server, well, it is kind of well controlled in kind of environment, right, and it's in single instance, right, or single cluster instance, you can always, validate how it's configured and so on and so forth, while you can have basically unlimited copies on your backup, of your backups, right, or dumps, which can be very hard to keep a track of, right? Where were they copied, right, and either was protected, maybe some of that was taken on a laptop, right, which is not encrypted and so on and so forth. Now, let's talk about the application vulnerabilities, right, in application. One is, well, of course, any significant application, it has bugs, right, and some of those bugs may be exploited, right, in terms of security by bad actors, right? You also can be worry about something what backdoors can be intentionally inserted in the application, right, which you go ahead and download and start to use, right? I think it was interesting to see some examples with like a SolarWinds a couple of years ago, right? Or I think if you look at a kind of a little bit like a different twist on that, right? Then war in Ukraine was started, right? Some people will essentially inject the code in an open source framework to say, oh, if you run on computer in Russia, we'll just rmrf/, right? So just to kill everything, right? Well, right. So that I think is interesting. What even in an open source space, right? Then we do have a source code. We also often rely on a goodwill of maintainer not to do things which is detrimental to our use case. And in general, that is a good way to make sure you have development, understanding what there are such actors possible, right? You want like to make sure you are thinking about like supply chain security, right, for all the components you use. You also want to make sure what you run the application with minimum privileges needed, and also monitor application behavior, right? So what if the application is doing something is not really doing well, is not supposed to do, then you want to be alerted on that. Now, if you think about the system components, right, what do we have here, and what do we mean in terms of potential to exposure? Well, actually, all of those items which may not be considered part of your core application can also be vulnerable, right? If you think about like operating system, that is a very complicated piece of software, including many, many components, right? And if you look at the CVEs discovered, right, it's really like almost every day, right, something is being released in this case. Now, things like a CPU, right, or other pieces of infrastructure, right? I mean, you guys probably have seen over years there have been number of vulnerabilities which relates to the CPU, right? Especially those, like those side channel attacks, right, and so on and so forth, which is was a new phenomenon, right? I mean, before that, right, we largely didn't see a lot of attacks which would try to expose, you know, flaws in the hardware to the same extent. Your infrastructure provider also can be hacked. I think what is interesting in this case is what we often get a lot of that a consolidation of risk, right, in this case. Because if you think about something like AWS, of course, the amount and qualification of the security people they have is, of course, higher than many companies can afford, right? But at the same time, that's also so much, you know, potential profit for hackers, right? If they can, you know, penetrate generally AWS infrastructure, right? So that is something where we have to understand what there is a risk, because if that were to happen to a significant extent, then all of us would be affected. I already spoke about supply line chain security, right, and various framework components, libraries you need to look at, and that is where I would encourage to make sure you understand what exactly the components you use, and make sure to have some process where you monitor SV database, right, and manage that appropriately. Well, SQL injection. Well, that is obviously a very common type of security bug, right? Which that basically means by injecting some specific input, we can get you know, some unintended behavior. Often it's getting data in, right? Sometimes it may be you know, some destructive materials, right? Or people were saying, hey, you know, if I pass, you know, like specially constructed password, right, I can maybe authenticate always, right? Like that's another thing, right? What people use, right? So that is, I think, is a thing to look at that. Now, what is interesting with SQL injection, right? This is something which is very, very old, right? I remember starting my work with MySQL, well, more than 20 years ago, right? And we often would talk about SQL injections, right? And people, you know, affected by them, well, did not quite go away, right? Now, some best practice in this case would be use prepared statements, right? Even if emulated. Note what prepared statements do not offer you, you know, complete saving from SQL injections, right? But they make things a lot better, right? And specifically, pay attention for dynamically generated queries, right? Because that is where a lot of you know, additional danger can happen, right? Especially if you use prepared statements, right? Because, well, if you use prepared statements, but if you generate the query and you generated it kind of wrong, it's still maybe vulnerable for SQL injections. What is interesting about SQL injection is if you look at top web application security risk, right? You can think what that has been one of the top items in the web application security risks, right, for many years, right? And it's still out there. which is kind of interesting, right, in this case. And I think that's good to talk to the developers in many cases, right, because even if you do not kind of very much care about your database, well, making sure you follow some of a database security best practices, like, for example, making sure you avoid SQL injections, because otherwise you're not taking care of a database. How a database SQL injection works can be illustrated by this comic. Anybody seen that before? No? You see, yeah, so the idea here, right, is what obviously the guys weren't properly properly escaping query, right, and then so he was able to add a little query, afterwards. That, of course, is kind of like a trivialized, right? Typically, right, in many environments, right, we actually would not allow that to say, oh, like I'll pass in you 2 queries instead of 1. No, right, wouldn't work, but concept is still good. Okay. Now, application service, right? Why your application service, a web service, right, or like maybe front service, right, are important to think about? Well, because often they are a lot closer to the attacker than your database. In majority of cases, the well-architected systems, attacker never have direct access to the database, right? That's kind of behind the firewall of a source. But, well, they have to interact with your application, of course, right? Otherwise, well, what's the point, right? And that applications often have enough attack surface, right? So intruder may be able to do something. And if this becomes a question about, well, what does that application has access to, right? Often the good practice is to make sure you're not just saying, well, that is my application, I'll trust it to do anything I want, but to apply the idea of a minimal security needed, right? To make sure what application can only do with a database what it can, as well as have good local account security, right? Because what that means is we want also to avoid, if I am able to compromise a given application, I want to make sure that does not convert to me getting full root access to the box, because that's obviously allows to continue getting havoc in the customer to do more damage. Now, when you speak about direct access to a database, now I think this is a very interesting point, right? There is a bunch of websites you can find which talks about, hey, we have found so many databases which are publicly accessible, right? Like in many cases you say, well, you can even access it with no password, right? Default password or a weak password. That is a bad idea, right? Now also know, even if your password is okay, if your database exposed publicly, well, if there are some externally exploitable CVEs, well, you may be able to get into a database rather easy. So basically, the best practice in this case is to make sure not to expose the database servers directly. We spoke about the network traffic, right, which can have a lot of sensitive data in it, and the best practice in this case is to make sure the network traffic is encrypted. Especially those days, it's not super expensive, right? Modern CPUs, they can encrypt data about like many gigabytes a second, right? They have a special, encryption instructions and so on and so forth. So if you set it up properly, that can be rather cheap and increase security a lot, right? If you look a lot of that, their modern concept, right? We are increasingly relying on the idea of the zero trust, right? Rather than saying, hey, you know what, we have this like a one sort of one border, right? And if you got in the local network, right, then, well, you're good to go, right? So that means often even locally, in the sort of like a local network, encrypting traffic between your application server and a database is a good idea. Yeah, I spoke about a test database as well, right? I mean, which can have a lot of sensitive data but not protected. Well, don't do that. But the best idea is to make sure if you use data from production, you sanitize that appropriately so it does not contain any real sensitive data. So the backups and data dumps, I also spoke about them a bit. The big thing what we've seen in this regard is in many cases people would store backups in the cloud, like on S3 buckets or something, and then those buckets would be either sort of permanently left open or even kind of, let's say, open, so I can easily download that to my, test box, right, or something, and then, forgotten in an open state. So take a very special attention to that. It is the best idea to make sure what you have your backups, wherever you take them, right, is encrypted, and don't store your encryption key with backups, right? Because in this case, well, even if somebody got access, for example, to S3 bucket where you store your backups and was able to download them, well, there was no encryption keys right in that bucket, and then, well, they're kind of not very useful. Okay. Now, let's move on to talk about the roles and the responsibilities, what you may have in your team, right? And I think what I found is what that gets kind of rather complicated, right? A lot of that depends on the organization type and complexity, right? In some cases, you may say, hey, you know what, we're just like a small startup, and we have, their CTO John, who is our DBA and a lead developer, right, and a lead security guy, right? And so everything can be done very easy, right? He doesn't need to, discuss many things with himself, right? And that can be getting all the way to large organizations where it's very kind of siloed, and often you would have that kind of like a combative approach with your security and compliance team, right? Those security guys, they just want, their job is not to keep things secure, but their job is to ensure we can get absolutely nothing done ever, right? One way you can think about that is to look at like developers who kind of write the code, and then there are all those DBAs, sysadmin, SecOps, right, who support that. The key thing in this case is really to really understand what the security is really there, the question, when it always becomes a shared responsibility. You cannot just say, oh, you know what, developers are doing their job to make things secure, and that's it, right? And then have operational security practices like which are bad, well, wouldn't work this way, right? You still have then some exposures possible at that time, and vice versa, right? If a database application developers implement crappy application with lots of holes, SQL injections, that's really very hard to ops people do anything to protect that. Okay. First of all, now let's talk about MySQL in 2023, and that means we will talk about MySQL 8. Okay, who is here running MySQL 8? Okay, who is not running MySQL 8 yet? MySQL 5.7 or something. Okay, some people again. Well, the thing to know about MySQL 5.7 is what MySQL 5.7 is, about to go end of life, right, and kind of to turn into a zombie, right? So just right, walking dead kind of, right? So you more want to make sure you upgrade to MySQL before, MySQL 8 before that. But now let's look at what MySQL 8 has to offer. Now, I think in general, in MySQL 8, there was a lot of work as relates to security, right? That's one thing important to understand. The other thing is what in MySQL 8, you can see continuing work on security in that milestone related, right? So I think if you are investigating maybe yourself, hey, what MySQL 8 has to offer in terms of security, well, look at latest release, right? Because if you looked at the MySQL 8, let's say a year ago, well, some things have been changed and added. And again, like Oracle, I think, placed a lot of stuff on security. Couple of things which I picked up in MySQL 8, which I think are good in terms of security. One is MySQL finally has support for roles. Right, I think that is very convenient to manage privileges, right? And while I say convenient, that means also that can allow us to create much more elaborate privilege policies than before was practical. Another cool thing MySQL 8 has is ability to get the partial revokes. Right? Before MySQL 8, you would only have to make sure you specifically grant what you are allowed to do, right? And if you want, I want everything but, you will essentially have to define that everything but and grant separately, right? So the most common use case where it's used is say, hey, I am creating a user, right? I am, let's say, maybe DBA. I'm giving the database to the user. I want to give them full privileges to do wherever they need, create any database and mess anything with that database, but I don't want them to be able to do anything with MySQL database because that is not their freaking business. Well, you can easily do that by granting required privileges on all the databases and then revoking privileges on MySQL database, right? Pretty cool. Yeah. Yeah, so for roles, right, I think I misordered the slides here a little bit, right? But here is an example, like how roles can do, right? And you can see what you can create roles, when you can grant certain things to roles, and then as you create the users, right, you can just grant them roles as a bucket of privileges instead of specific privileges, much easier to manage. The next thing is TLS. TLS is something which is obviously not used new in MySQL, right? Especially before you go like many years back, right? We used SSL name only. But what are specific things in MySQL which are which you need to consider? One is require secure transport to accept secure connections, right? Because otherwise you may still have some connections which are accepted without TLS, right? And well, those would be insecure, right? And that's very easy to make that make sense. Now, MySQL also has a settings to have SSL chippers and TLS versions which are allowed. And that is good because, especially like for some mitigation things, right? In certain cases, you would find what there was some problem found which corresponds to specific TLS version or specific chippers. Well, then you can actually disable them, right, as a very low effort, right, and maybe move to something else as a relatively low effort mitigation, right. The other very cool thing what we now have with MySQL 8 is what you can reconfigure TLS without restarting server, right? And that is often the challenge of TLS, if you will, because if you want to follow best practices, you want to make sure you create certificates which expire, and they don't expire like in 50 years, right? But they actually expire on related regular basis, right? So if somebody gets access to those certificates, right, we don't kind of have, there is a sort of, it's only usable, right, for a period of time. But previously, it was a big problem, right, because you would have to restart your MySQL to reapply configuration. Not with MySQL 8 anymore. Like here are some examples, right? Like I can create also on a user basis to require SSL, right? I can require X509 authentication. I can require specific shippers, right? What I also can have is I can define in MySQL, so like either specific certificates what that user has, right, as a way to for authentication, right? Now, if we need to look at the SSL or like TLS, right, what you want really to be doing is understand you want to make sure what you have. You are requiring obviously TLS, but then also you want to make sure you are actually using specific certificates, right, which are checked, just like accepting any certificate, right, that creates their vulnerability right there. Okay. The other thing what MySQL 8 introduced is dynamic privileges, right? Which is kind of maybe internal definitions first and foremost, right? But before, if you think about MySQL, each privilege was kind of column in a MySQL user table. And that means the process of adding new privilege was kind of tough, right? You would need to alter table, right? And that has to be very, very careful. And that also means is they have to be static, right? Only those privileges exist. So you have something like a plugin which wants to introduce a new privilege. Well, you can't have it, or you couldn't again before MySQL 8. In MySQL 8, that feature was added, and that means different plugins can be introduced in different privileges, which are defined by the plugins at runtime. For example, you have some plugin which provides backup. It can define privilege backup admin, and if you grant that privilege, well, the functionality of that plugin can be used. If not, not, right? So that is something which is conceptual, which allows developers building MySQL and plugins for MySQL to improve that. In MySQL 8, also the new authentication was added. Cache and SH2 password is faster and more secure than legacy authentication thing, right? The thing you would have to note is some old clients may not support and will require this MySQL native password mode instead, right? Which you can use, but in my opinion, MySQL 8 with this new authentication method was out for long enough time, so all the language and frameworks generally support this new authentication yet, right? So I would, if you're running into problems, I would rather see upgrading those to the new versions. MySQL 8 also comes with password policies, right? I think that can be, pretty helpful. Again, especially in terms of the compliance stuff, right? Because in many cases, people would manage through their sort of like a manual process of password rotation and so on and so forth, right? Anyway, but it's much easier to deal with kind of compliance when you can say, well, you know what, we have this process to expire MySQL passwords, right? And we are not relying on us remembering when passwords have to be expired. Well, that's controlled by a policy set in a database, right? And we just need to make sure while we deal with that. So here are some examples of a policy password, right? Like, for example, you can set a policy which sets a password. What password allow the password length policies, right? When you're trying to set password too weak, it tells us, hey, you know, your password doesn't specify this. What I think it's interesting also in this case is what MySQL now has this function, which I think is quite cool, right? Again, maybe even kind of usable, you know, beyond MySQL, right? If your language doesn't have a good password validation function, right? You can validate password strength, right? And you can see we can get a sort of like a score how strong the password is, right? In addition to just requiring certain strength. Dual password is another feature I like. This password allows you to account a primary and secondary password and is used for password rotation, right? Especially at scale. Because think about that, right? If you look at large environment and you want to rotate the password, you want the MySQL to be updated with a new password, right? And your application, right? And if you still want to continue to be connected to Worker, they have to, well, somehow agree on that, right? The previously way to do that, if you look at it in secure way, would be to have an application essentially have like a manual dual password saying, oh, I'm connecting with that new password. If I fail, then I try to connect with the old password, right, to manage that. But that's kind of not very robust and manual. Now, you can essentially do a very similar thing just on the MySQL stuff. When you specify old password and new password, right, and the MySQL will automatically do it by itself, right? Then you would essentially set up a new password on a MySQL server, then change it in the application, and then delete the old password, right? So as you can see, in this case, we are adding the new password for a user, right? And say, hey, we want to retain current password, kind of, hey, do not just kill it yet. And then we go ahead and then we update our application. And then after we have done that, we can go ahead and instruct MySQL to discard the old password, right? And here are a couple of links on Percona blog, right, which you may find interesting. FIPS mode, that is another new thing in MySQL 8, which is you know, maybe usable for the highly secure environments, right? So yeah, so and what that does is security features which are not FIPS compatible will stop working, right? So for example, you won't be able to create MD5 hash anymore, right? Right. So and that is done just to make sure potentially not to expose users to insecure functions, right? Because maybe you're using MD5 for something which is not cryptographically sensitive, right? But well, we still want to use it. In MySQL encryption, right? MySQL encryption, that's also where there have been a lot of improvements, right? And actually the last one I think is wrong, right? That's I forgot to scrub it from there. So finally in the latest MySQL you can improve everything in MySQL, including the system table space, double write buffer, right? So and the encryption in MySQL is rather rather inexpensive. The thing, though, with encryption, the challenge with encryption, right, is often not encryption itself, but also the storage of a key with which you do encryption, right? Because if you do encryption, right, and then the key is easily accessible, that is not very secure, right? Now, in this case, you would see what MySQL Community essentially provides you very simple storage, right, for security key, and the MySQL Enterprise provide you more advanced option. Though that is where you can also check the Percona server for MySQL, which has additional more secure options, right, for security key, such as HashiCorp Vault, right? So yet another reason to run Percona server. In backups, well, both in MySQL Enterprise Backup and Percona Extra Backup, we support encryption those days. If you are using MySQL dump, it does not encrypt the data directly, but typically you would just, pipe it through some encryption software to get it encrypted. And well, guess what, right? You also would need to maintain the key yourself. Pluggable authentication. Well, that is another feature in MySQL which corresponds to the idea, like what if you don't want to store your user passwords in MySQL at all? Well, MySQL has a number of pluggable authentications, such as LDAP, Windows, Kerberos, right, in MySQL Enterprise, right, and we also have in Percona server number of authentications, pluggable authentication implemented, right, in open source. Now, I mentioned also often you want to make sure you can spot their maybe intrusion in a progress, or if it happened, to understand what actually was exposed, right? What did that intruder touch? And that is where access auditing, right, can be helpful. With access audit, you can access audit, right, you essentially can store every information about data about what was accessed. It is expensive, right? So usually it's used in a more like secure, sensitive environments, right, where security more important than performance, right? But it is very, very handy. Now, with our audit plugin, similar to what I mentioned before, it is available in MySQL Enterprise as well as Percona server for MySQL as open source, right? And this is kind of an example of the audit record, right? What can connect, right? And I wanted to show here what audit log actually contains information about more than just the queries you run, right? Like in this case, you can actually record when that user actually disconnected from the database, right? That's also will be in the log, right? With whole bunch of status, right? And that is, I would say, you get those auditing log, right? Getting them into some system which can deal with a lot of volume. Like I think Alken before I spoke about ClickHouse. That can be very good source for this kind of data, right? To store relative high compression and to be able to run queries conveniently. Data masking. Well, data masking is another important thing, which is often done with like a test data generation and so on, and so forth, right? And in both in MySQL as well as in Percona server, right? We have the plugins which can help you to mask the data. Right. One thing I want to say is what the keyword here is help to mask the data. Right. So it doesn't just say, hey, oh, you know what? Here is my database. Dear Mr. Plugin, please figure out what are things which are sensitive, and then mask them with something, and also with that retain some properties of the data. Right. So like credit card numbers look like credit card numbers, but they are obviously meaningless. Well, that is not what the tooling does, but that allows you to simplify that. Let's say, hey, if you want to, get things which look like social security numbers and such. Firewalling. Firewalling is very helpful in, and I would say like in a couple of cases. One, you can actually block queries to a MySQL database which don't match certain rules, right? Or same as if you network firewalls, you can also log the queries which break those rules, right? And then you can, in addition to login, maybe take some action on them, right? Maybe you can say, hey, you know what, if application is starting to misbehaving, well, I can get some alerts, so I can take a look at what's going on, right? And if developer deployed the new queries without telling me, right, and maybe kind of go and slap his hands, if that is some sort of an intrusion in a progress, well, then I can deal with that instead. It is available in MySQL, and MySQL is MySQL Enterprise Firewall, right? If you're looking at an open source solution, their ProxySQL has some great firewalling features. Well, that is the most important stuff with MySQL Security. With that, I wanted to maybe get, let's say, some public announcements for you folks. Anybody here have been to Percona Live before? So yes, well, Percona Live is a conference Percona puts together. It is about open source databases, and specifically like MySQL has a lot of cool contents here. Many of the speakers you see here at Scale also speak at Percona Live. So yeah, if you're interested, check it out. It will be in Denver, Colorado, right? And also this time we are putting together this interesting, like a social event before a conference, right? So you can go and participate in a relay race as a part of a different teams when you have different correspond to different database technologies. Maybe one you like, so you can really work for them, or maybe one you hate, so you can join their team, right, and then just run backwards. Well, with that, that's all I had to say. We'll be happy to answer some questions. I think I have another minute or two. No? Questions? What's that? Oh, yes, microphone in case somebody does. Well, you see, they're all very experienced people. I didn't tell them anything new. But, well, thank you. Hopefully that was a good refresher for some of you.